All right, welcome back to part 2 of the Sketchup video series. So in part 1, we covered how to make basic shapes and how to navigate your workspace in Sketchup, and then we went through step by step and modeled this console that you see here. In this part, we're going to take this model and essentially turn it into a virtual piece of furniture that we can use to build this piece in real life. And by the end, we're going to know any potential problems that we might run into, and we're going to know how much material that we're going to need to buy. And I'm going to show you a way to make a nicer export or kind of a more artistic version of your models. All that said, the biggest benefit for me in doing this is that it really lets me wrap my head around a piece better before I start building, and it just helps me to be more confident going into a project. Now, for a lot of people, this just might be a lot of extra work that they don't need to do, but everybody's brain works a little differently, and this is legitimately something that I do for every piece that I build. And I guess at the very least, by the time you've done part 1 and now part 2 of this series, you're going to be more than proficient to model your own ideas in SketchUp. All right, so if you have not watched part 1, you definitely want to go and do that now before you start in on part 2. And if you're modeling along, things are going to move quite a bit more quickly because I'm just going to assume that you've watched part 1 and that you understand what's going on. So I'm not going to be re-explaining the tools every time that I use them. And if you are modeling along, also be prepared to use the pause button a lot. All right, let's hop in. So our model's exactly where we left off in part 1. And the first thing that I'm going to do, just to make things a little bit easier to see on your end, is first I'm going to go to Window, Shadows, and turn those on. And then we can close that box. And then I'm going to go to Window and Styles. And then under the Edit tab and the background options, I'm going to change the background color to a sort of dark gray. And then in the face options, I'll choose this option so that the piece is white. And I think that this contrast should just make it a little bit easier to see what's going on your YouTube screen. You don't need to do any of this in your SketchUp model if you don't want to, but you can if you like. Anyway, then I'm just going to save this as my style again in my in-model options so that I can quickly jump between these two styles if I want to. Okay, so when we initially modeled our carcass, I made the top, bottom, and side pieces all an inch thick, and it was also basically just a big monolithic box that included the back panel. But maybe I've decided that I want to use 3/4 inch plywood, so the first thing I'm going to do is change that. So I'll use the ruler tool to mark a line 3/4 inch in from my top panel, and then I'm going to use the protractor to make a guideline at a 45-degree angle. And the reason that I'm doing this is because we're going to be using plywood, and a miter joint's going to hide the plywood edges on the sides. But anyway, the way that you're going to do this is we'll click once here where we want the outside of our bevel to be. Then I'm going to drag straight down and click again. And then I'm going to start angling it. And if you're in the circle, it'll snap to 15-degree increments. But the easiest way to be really specific is after you've started moving it along the degrees in the direction that you want, just take your hand off the mouse and type in 45 and hit enter. So we're going to go ahead and do that on both sides. And then I'm going to use the line tool to trace out the shape of our top panel. And then we'll use the push pull tool to make it the proper width. And then we can delete our original box and make the top a component. Okay, next I'm going to copy our top panel using the move tool. Remember, we'll do that by making sure that we have this little plus toggled on by hitting our option key. And then I'm going to flip it along the component's blue axis and then use the move tool to put it in the position where our bottom panel should go. And you might have a little trouble positioning it. So what I like to do is get it roughly in place, and then I'll kind of hover my move tool over the bottom face of the component, not an edge, and freeze it to the blue axis and try to reference the top edge of my base, and that should snap things together. All right, next we're going to make our 2 side panels, and we can kind of just fill in the negative space to do this. So I'll grab the line tool and trace that out, then extrude it to the proper width, make it a component, and flip and duplicate it along the red axis and put it in position. All right, things are looking good, but now we have to make our back panel. So the easiest way to recess a back panel in a mitered case is with a simple rabbet along the back edge. So to do that, let's start editing the top panel by double clicking it. And then I'm going to use the line tool and I'll just hover it over the bevel edge and it should snap to the midpoint. And then I'm going to draw a line all the way across the piece and then use the push-pull tool to recess it in by 1/2 inch, which is going to be the thickness of our back panel. Then we can just do the same thing on our side panel. And as you get to the bottom, you'll notice that the bottom panel already has the rabbet, and that's because it's a duplicate of the top panel. So with that, all 4 rabbets are cut now. All right, next I'm going to get the rectangle tool and make a rectangle from the inside corner to the other inside corner, which is going to represent the inside face of our back panel. And then we can extrude that to 1/2 inch thick and make it a component. And there's our back. Okay, here I'm hitting Command 3 to jump into a front view of my piece. And now I can see that even though our case is looking good, our drawers are too small now. And that's because the interior of our cabinet just grew by 1/4 inch in each direction. Now, for that same reason, I know that our doors are going to be too small as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of them and remodel. Technically, we could just edit them, but this is going to be almost as fast and probably easier to explain. So the first thing that we need to do is resize our 2 vertical partitions. So we'll just edit them and then use the push-pull tool to drag them to our new inside faces. And then let's go ahead and hide our back panel for a minute. Now, when we made our first version of this, we never modeled in any joinery for our partitions. It was just a butt joint. But let's say that we want to use the Stopped Dado for this joint, which is probably what I would use most frequently. So to do that, the first thing that I'm going to do is make a guideline that represents where I want the dado in my cabinet to stop. So I'm going to choose 16.5 inches from the back inside corner. So I'll just drag along that direction and type 16.5 and hit enter. Now, if I orbit around the backside, actually, first I'm noticing that our partitions aren't long enough. So I'm going to edit those and bring those equal to the back edge of the inside corner of our rabbet. And then we can start drawing in our dados. Okay, so there's a lot of ways that we can do dados. I personally prefer a tenon and a thinner dado versus a full width dado where the entire panel sits in it. So to draw that, I'm going to make a pair of guidelines that are inset from each face on the panel by 1/4 inch, which is going to leave a 1/4 inch wide tenon. Then to model it in, I'm going to make sure that I'm editing my bottom panel and not the partition. And I'll draw lines along those guidelines that come down even with the depth of the rabbet that we had just modeled in. And then I'm going to use the push-pull tool to make that dado even with the guidelines that we drew towards the front of the cabinet. Then we'll do the same thing for our second partition. Okay, so no need to do this, but just to show you, here you can see that we've got our dados cut into our top panel as well, since it's a duplicate. All right, now I just decided that I want my left partition to also be a little bit inset. So I'm gonna circle around and recess that by 1/2 inch. And then we'll go back to the backside to create our tenons. So I'm actually going to make a duplicate of my top panel just because it's going to be a little bit easier to see what I'm doing. And honestly, it's going to be kind of helpful for modeling as well. But anyway, to make the actual tenon, I'm going to make sure that I'm editing my vertical partition and use the line tool to draw it to fit the dado. Then I'll use the push-pull tool to extrude it and hover it over the front of my dado. And if I look at the bottom right of my screen here, I can see that it's telling me that my tenon would be 16.5 inches long, which was how long we made our dado. But I know that in real life, because I'm going to cut this with a router, it's going to leave a round tip unless I chisel it, but I don't want to do that. So the much easier solution is to make my tenon just a little bit short. So rather than 16.5 inches, I'm just going to type 16, hit enter, and that's going to leave a 1/2 inch gap at the front. And then I will delete this line. Okay, now I'm going to duplicate my partition over here, just because sometimes it's easier to model without seeing everything else, and it'll definitely be easier to watch. But anyway, next we'll basically just do the same thing again to create our tenon on the bottom of our partition, and to extrude it, I'll just match what we did on the top. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing for my other partition, and then I'm going to delete all of my extra components, and I'll unhide my back panel. Okay, next I want to make an inside chamfer on my exterior panels, so the top, bottom, and the two sides. So I'm going to make a guideline 1/4 of an inch up from the inside, draw a line all the way across, and then use the move tool to recess the bottom edge by 1/4 of an inch. And that's going to create a 45-degree chamfer. And then I'm just going to do the same thing on the side panels as well. All right, now let's make our drawer faces. So what I'm going to do is get the line tool and let it snap to the inside edge of my vertical partition. And then I'm going to draw a rectangle all the way around this cubby, and then I'll make that a component. And actually looking at it, I think I want this partition to come forward a bit. So I'm going to use the push-pull tool to bring it up flush with my chamfer. Okay, now let's go back to editing this panel. And I'm going to get my line tool and let it snap to the midpoint, and then draw a line all the way across and delete the bottom half of the panel. So this is going to be a drawer face, and I want it to be 3/4 of an inch thick. So we'll go ahead and use the push-pull tool to make that happen. And now at the moment, this drawer face is the same size as the opening, which obviously wouldn't work. So I'm going to have to make myself some 1/8 inch gaps. So with the push-pull tool selected, you can kind of see how this face gets these dots whenever I'm hovering over it. So I want to move above it to just where it stops being highlighted. And even though I can't see it, I'll know that my top edge is selected. So I'm just going to click and then drag it down and type 1/8 to move it the appropriate amount, which is 1/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the left and right sides of the drawer face, but not on the bottom. And then I'm going to copy a duplicate all the way down to the bottom and then move it up by 1/8 of an inch. So at this point, everything should be looking pretty good, except that there's no gap between the two drawer faces. So what I'm going to do is select the top drawer face and move the bottom edge up by 1/16 of an inch, which is going to do the same thing on the bottom of my drawer face, since they're duplicates. Then I can move the bottom drawer face down by 1/16 of an inch, and then that should leave 1/8 inch gaps everywhere, all perimeters and between the two drawers. And by the way, if you're wondering how I got into this sort of flattened view, go to camera and change from perspective to parallel projection. But in any case, I'm going to go back into perspective view now. All right, next I want to put that half circle drawer pull detail back onto our drawer face. But before we do that, I actually want to put a similar chamfer detail around the perimeter of the drawer face, and we're going to use a new tool to get that done called the Follow Me tool. So we're starting here with another duplicate of our drawer copied up above into free space. And I'm going to make myself a pair of guidelines spaced 1/4 of an inch in from each edge of any front corner. Then I'll edit the component and draw a diagonal line. Next, I want to select the 4 perimeter edges along the front of my drawer face. And the easiest way to do that is by double clicking the front face and then holding Option and Shift on your keyboard and clicking the face once to deselect it, which will leave the perimeter edges selected. And by the way, when you hold Option and Shift, you should see this little subtract icon appear. But anyway, with those still highlighted, get the Follow Me tool and click on your little diagonal face, and that's going to make that detail follow all the way along whatever path you had selected. Okay, with that done, now we can cut our finger pull back in. And here we're going to have to kind of emulate a Forstner bit. So what we're going to do is get the circle tool and hover it over the midpoint of the top edge on the back side of our face. And then we'll start drawing and type 0.75 and hit enter. Then I'm going to use the push-pull tool to extrude a cylinder that goes all the way through the drawer face. Then I'll select the drawer face and triple click it to make sure that all of the faces and edges are selected. and then right click and choose Intersect Faces and With Model. Then I can delete my cylinder and it'll leave these lines where things had intersected. And then I can just delete what I want to get rid of. Now, unfortunately, this is going to delete some of the faces that I needed as well. So I'm just going to quickly draw those back in with a series of straight lines. And there are ways that you can do this without losing the faces, but it requires plugins and a bunch of stuff that's just kind of beyond the scope of this tutorial. So this is just kind of a minor annoyance that we're going to have to deal with for this specific occasion. Okay, but anyway, I guess one good byproduct of that is I can show you how to delete unwanted lines without losing faces. So if you were to just erase these lines right now, you would basically do what we just did in reverse. But if you get the eraser tool and hold Option while you erase, you're basically just making the lines invisible rather than actually deleting them. So the faces will stay. Anyway, with that done, we'll move on to the sliding doors. So let's quickly model those back in. I just need to make sure that I'm drawing it long enough so that it's actually going across the thickness of my vertical partition to the face on the opposite side. And then I'm going to make it 1/2 inch thick and duplicate it so that I'm leaving 1/4 inch between the two doors. And then I'll just recess both a little bit more so that the front door is recessed by 1/4 inch from the front inside edge of the chamfer. Okay, now I'm going to hide the front doors for a minute so that we can model in the grooves that the doors will need to slide in. So here I'm drawing in a few guidelines. I'm making this first 1/4 inch in from the front edge. Then I'll make another 1/2 inch away, then another 1/4 inch away, and then one more at another 1/2 inch. So that these are where the doors are located. From there, I'm going to get the rectangle tool and draw a long rectangle that's 1/2 inch wide and the entire length of the two cubbies. Then I'm going to duplicate that and move the copy to where the second groove was going to need to be. Then I'm going to get the push-pull tool and recess that in by 1/8 inch. Okay, now I'm going to duplicate the bottom panel and move it off to the right here so that you can see the problem that this is going to cause, which is that the groove is going to end a little bit shy of the bevel, where in actuality it would extend all the way to the end. So there's a few different ways that we can model this in, but the easiest in my opinion is to just draw the lines in really quickly with the line tool. So I'm going to snap a line that's running along the same path as the line on the bottom of the groove, and then I'll just extend it so that it goes out to the bevel's edge. And I'll do the same thing on the other side, and you can see these little dots where it's intersecting with the bevel's face. So just connect those dots and then erase the lines that you don't need. And we'll quickly do the same thing on the back groove. Okay, then if we go over to the other side, we'll want to extend these grooves under the vertical partition by another 1/8 inch. And that's because we're going to model these same grooves into the partition, which is just a matter of making a pair of rectangles and then recessing them in by 1/8 inch. All right, so I'm just checking out my model here real quick, and it's looking good, so now we can move on. All right, so next we're going to model these grooves into the side panel, and we're going to run into that same issue that we did with the bottom panel on the bevel side. And typically I would just do the exact same thing that we did on the bottom panel, but just to show you something different, but kind of equally annoying, I could create two, I guess you'd say, positive molds of the negative spots that I want to create. And then I just need to make sure that they were protruding 1/8 inch into my panel. And I could do that whole intersect with model trick and then add back in the lines that I need to fill the hollow spots. Something different, again, but equally annoying. All right, well, let's unhide our doors back into the model. And then I'm actually going to hide everything in our model other than the doors and the panels that the doors are going to interact with, just to make it easier to explain this next part. And actually, I guess I'm going to hide this panel too. And here you can see how the doors will go into our grooves a little bit better. So obviously these doors are going to be affected by gravity, and thus they're going to need to rest on something. So I'm going to extend the bottom down so that it's hitting the bottom of the groove. Then if we move up to the top, we can do the same thing, extending it by another 1/8 of an inch so that it's touching the top of the groove. Okay, now I'm going to duplicate my top panel up here. And you can see that right now it's also a flipped duplicate of my bottom panel. So I'm going to select the two top panels, right click, and select Make Unique so that these aren't the same as the bottom panel anymore. Then I'm going to edit my top panel by recessing the groove a little bit more. Now I can see here that there's 5/8 of an inch of thickness left. So I'm just going to recess it by another 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to extend the grooves through the bevel's face, just like we did a few minutes ago. And just in case you're wondering why I'm doing this, it's because if the top groove is the same as the bottom, it would be impossible to take the doors in and out after the cabinet's assembled. Basically, you'd have to put it in mid-assembly, and then it would be trapped there forever. But if we leave some free space on top of the door, that allows us to lift it up high enough that the bottom will clear the bottom panel, and we could take it in and out. Okay, now let's unhide everything. So at this point, we know exactly how big our doors need to be, so we can quickly model in the finger pool again, and things are looking pretty good. Okay, so you might remember in the first video, we talked a little bit about iterating on a design. But I'm going to do that again just to show you how to quickly model a different style of base, since you might want to play with these kinds of designs. Which we'll do right after we thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So I've been using Squarespace for about 4 years now, and honestly, it's been great. Prior to that, I used to code everything on my own, which is fine if you like doing that, but it's hard and takes time, and honestly, the outcome wasn't as nice as the templates that I use now with Squarespace. And the worst part was, it was taking me away from doing the things that I really should be focusing on, like getting better at Sketchup. Now, in addition to Squarespace making it super easy to build and maintain your site, buy domains, and all that stuff, they also have plenty of e-commerce, which has been really helpful since we started selling plans. Things like inventory management, a simple and secure checkout process, and unlimited products allow us to easily manage our online transactions. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you have one already that you think could be better, you owe it to yourself to at least check out Squarespace and see if it might be a better option for you. Just head over to squarespace.com/4eyes for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. So to do that, I'm going to make a duplicate of my entire model and then erase the base. Then I'm going to draw a 2D rectangle that runs the entire length of the cabinet and from its underside to the ground. And then I'm going to bring in each edge by 1 inch and make it a component. Okay, next I'm going to get the Protractor tool and make myself a line at 30 degrees. So I'll click the bottom corner, drag up, click again, then start dragging the way that I want the protractor to go, and type 30 and hit enter. From there, I'm going to get the line tool and draw in a line that follows that guideline, and this would represent the outside edge of a splayed tapered leg. Then I'm going to go 5 inches in to the right from the top, and then I'll make another line about 1.5 inches in to the right from the bottom, and then I can connect both of those, and I'm really just guessing here. But anyway, for this purpose, I think this looks good enough. So I'm going to make that a component and duplicate it and flip it over to the other side. Next, I'm going to mark a guideline 3 inches down from the top of my base. And then move the bottom line of this rectangle up to that. And this is going to become a stretcher. And I think it's looking pretty good. So with all 3 of these pieces highlighted, I'm just going to right click and hit explode. And then with them all still selected, I'll remake it into one component. All right, now I'm going to get the eraser tool and just get rid of all these extra lines that are extending too far. And at this point, we basically have one monolithic shape. Then I'm going to get the arc tool and connect these 2 points and start dragging up and type 1 and enter so that the arc is 1 inch high in the center. From there, I'm going to get the eraser tool and erase the straight line. And then I'm going to get some guidelines again and mark some lines that are 1 inch away and parallel to each of these lines. And then I'll use the arc tool to create a transition between those points. Okay, then I'll do the same thing on the other side and give this thing some thickness by using the push-pull tool to drag it towards the background by 1 1/4 inches. Okay, so now I'm going to just quickly go through the rest of this. I'm basically just deleting some of the extra lines and drawing in some minors. But the whole goal here is just to look at the 2 side by side to see which I prefer. And I actually think that I like this version on the left a little bit more for this design. So I'm going to go with that one, and I'm just going to get rid of this tapered leg base. Okay, so at this point we have a full model and we could go out and actually build this piece. We have all the information. Well, other than drawer boxes. We never made those. But just for example, you could make yourself detailed drawings of specific pieces or whatever you need to help yourself get the job done. And we've also encountered and solved a lot of the issues that we might have run into while we were building. So the next thing that I'm going to show you is how we can use our model to figure out how much wood we're going to need to buy. So to do that, I'm going to duplicate my entire model, and then I'm going to draw a 4x8 rectangle that represents a sheet of plywood. Then I'm going to nest all of the plywood panels within those. And then I'm going to group together my hardwood pieces of similar thicknesses. Thickness? And based on that, I can see that I'd want 3 pieces of 4/4 hardwood material that's at least 6 inches wide and 8 feet long. And I'd need 1 piece of 8/4 hardwood that's 6 inches wide and 8 feet long. And then for the plywood, I would buy 2 sheets of 3/4 inch material, and I would end up with a huge chunk left over for another project. And then I'd buy 1 sheet of 1/2 inch material, which I'd use for my back panel, and I'd be able to get my drawer box material from this as well. Okay, so there's just one last thing that I want to show you, and this was something that I used a lot whenever I was doing commissioned builds, and I wanted to show a client what the piece might potentially look like in a more artistic representation, but not really a full-blown render. So let's start by getting rid of everything other than our model, and then we're just going to orbit around until we find an angle that we want to use. And once I have it, I'm going to go up to View and pick Animation and Add Scene. So once you do that, this little scene button is going to show up at the top of your workspace. And if we accidentally orbit or zoom or whatever, we can click this button and it'll always put us back in this exact view. Okay, next I'm going to bring up my styles window. And essentially what I'm going to do is composite a few styles over one another to make something more artistic looking. So in my opinion, the best styles come from the sketchy edges and the straight line tabs. And you can just click around on them and see what appeals to you. But I'm just going to kind of randomly pick 2 and then export those. So once you find one that you like, you can refine it a little bit in the styles window by messing around with these options here. And then I'm going to go to File, Export, and 2D Graphic and save it to my desktop or a folder, wherever you want. Then I'm going to quickly select a different style and do the same thing. And then I'm going to export one more graphic by making sure that the edges box is unchecked so that it looks like this. And this is just going to be a shadow layer. Oh, and by the way, I had made sure that shadows were off in the first two that I exported. Okay, so from here, you're going to need some sort of photo editing software. I'm using Photoshop, but there are free pieces of software that you can use that'll do the same thing. And essentially what you want to do is open all 3 photos in one project, but in different layers. Then you're just going to change the blend mode to multiply and mess around with the opacity. Then once you like the looks of it, you can save it and it'll just give you a more unique artistic look. So if I'm being honest, this one isn't great, but you can mess with it and you can get some pretty cool effects. All right, well, I'm going to leave this one here for now. So hopefully you enjoyed this series. And if you didn't catch everything, don't worry. I would just recommend watching it again, model along, and just use the pause button a lot. And honestly, if you got hung up in any spots, like I said before in the first video, just Google it. Anything you can think to search has almost certainly been asked in a forum or on Reddit, or honestly, there's probably a specific YouTube video about it. So don't be worried if you didn't catch everything. By now, you should have a pretty solid foundation to build off of and continue to improve. So happy modeling. And if you like this video and you want to support the show, check out my Patreon page. You can get a t-shirt and access to a bunch of my old SketchUp models. And it's a great place to interact with me, ask questions, and all that good stuff. All right, I'll see you in the next one.